Good morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook video for today, Sunday, end of the week, June 23rd, 2024. Starting off with the National Hurricane Center homepage to see what's going on in the Atlantic right now. And we're obviously talking about Invest 93L, which is in the Gulf of Mexico, and it is running on borrowed time. There's still a chance that this could maybe try to quickly become a tropical system before it heads inland over Mexico tonight. So this is running on very limited time. Although we'll see, Recon is actually going into the system right now, so we'll see if they do indeed find anything that could potentially make this tropical cyclone worthy of any chance. But either way, regardless, obviously there will be heavy rainfall and flash flooding as a big concern for portions of northeastern Mexico, and I think also southern Texas as well over the next several days. The typical threats that you would get with these kind of systems, either way, regardless of whether or not they become a named storm. But other than that, nothing else in the Atlantic. And the Eastern Pacific, very surprisingly and very interestingly, for the past several weeks has remained absolutely activity-less. It is bone dry. Nothing expected in the Eastern Pacific over the next several days, or there's at least not any major confidence that anything will occur as of right now. So, with that being said, let's take a look at a satellite image of the Atlantic. You can see 93L, very small system right now. Some convective activity associated with it, but you could see it is just very close to the Mexican coastline, and it really does not have that much time left to become much of anything tropical in terms of designatable into a tropical system, especially with the name. So I really wouldn't focus much attention on 93L, but it obviously is still there. And then besides that, across the rest of the Atlantic, ITCZ somewhat active. There are a few tropical waves in here, and a few tropical waves that we might need to watch over the next week or so as they move westward into the Caribbean, because I'll talk about it in a little bit, but it doesn't seem like things will exactly quiet down just yet. There's still chances that we might get development as we close the month of June out and we head into July, especially once again in the Caribbean, and some ensembles as well, hinting at things getting going potentially in the MDR, or at least there's a few chances that some of these waves might be strong enough that eventually one of them might try to develop. That's at least in terms of ensemble signals by the European, that as well, which we'll go over towards the end of the video. But obviously, nothing really going to develop much right now. There's obviously shear in the way in a lot of areas, dry air too, in terms of our Saharan air layer. And let's actually take a look at that right now. The Saharan air layer right now in the Atlantic. Lots of dry air coming off the continent of Africa, although once again, as I will continue to mention throughout the season, especially for the early season, this is very typical. Saharan air usually is at its peak during the early months of the hurricane season, which is why we don't really watch for much development to occur in the eastern Atlantic. It's why we really only look towards August if we're looking at anything major coming out of this area, because a lot of times they tend to choke, not joke, on dry air in the MDR, and most of the times these waves don't end up developing, and if they do, especially early on around this time of year, and especially for July, if we do get anything to develop, they usually only are short-lived tropical systems in the MDR that after several days get choked on by dry air. So bottom line, regardless, the dry air is still there. It'll still inhibit the Atlantic no matter what, even if this year is expected to be active. So I wouldn't concern yourself way too much with the fact that we have a lot of dry air out there. But I'm sure, especially as we head towards the end of this month into the early part of next month, again, I'm mentioning maybe one of these waves just might be lucky enough that it'll try, although we'll have to see. Taking a look at sea surface temperature anomalies, I feel like we haven't looked at this in a while, but here they are. Obviously, throughout the entire Atlantic, remaining very warm, and that's also one of the reasons why I say that things could get lucky that one of these waves out here might try to develop. Just look in the MDR. on average throughout basically the entire MDR, except maybe the far eastern part near Africa, although that somewhat has to do with the fact that we have a lot of Saharan air right now, so really wouldn't be concerned too much with maybe these one or two plots that show slightly below anomalies off Africa. But in general, in the MDR as a whole, on average, at least one, even widespread areas of 2 degrees Celsius above normal. So very warm, lots of energy in the MDR. And that's pretty much established for the hurricane season so far. I think we've established that the MDR is very warm and it'll work very much in favor of the Atlantic this year. And then we have the La Nina, or the developing La Nina. Right now it's only at neutral state, but you could see cold anomalies obviously developing along the equatorial Pacific associated with La Nina that is expected later this year. So we have that. And so generally things remain very active, or in a very favorable pattern, as we would expect for an active hurricane season. But then as you take our attention to the Gulf, especially after Alberto and everything that we've had in the Gulf, surprisingly, it still was above normal, especially in the Bay of Campeche. Anomalies remain very much above normal, as much as even a degree Celsius, even although the Gulf has definitely cooled down quite a bit over the last several days or so. And I'll show you that here on the anomalies. This is the anomaly change by CDAS on Tropical Tidbits. You could find this and notice in the Gulf, we've really cooled down a lot over the last several days. But I want to bring this to your attention, mainly not to be focused on the fact that the Gulf has cooled down, but to really mention to you that this is more or less a fact of we've seen this cooling because of all the energy that we've seen, all the moisture that we've seen associated with the Central American gyre setup over the last several weeks in the Gulf, which obviously has an effect on taking out energy from the ocean, because obviously how warm the Gulf is definitely fueled all of the moisture that we had in the Caribbean to spring up into thunderstorms. So obviously the Gulf is cooler, but I will tell you, it is June, and especially as we're heading into July, and as we get this huge heat ridge that is already building and is already bringing very hot weather to portions of the east, especially the northeast today, where there's actually a slight risk for severe weather. Actually an enhanced risk, but at least in my area here in New York City, I live in New York City, yes, we're under a slight risk today, so there's the potential for lots of heat, and that especially is the case in July with the Bermuda High that sets up and brings lots of heat, especially to the eastern half of the United States. And what I'm trying to tell you is that the Gulf of Mexico will warm up in no time, especially this time of year. Sometimes it only takes a week for the Gulf to fully warm back up to where it was before it cooled down. So don't be shocked at this. It is not surprising yet, in my opinion, that the Gulf has cooled down this much, especially given what has happened over the last week or so. And I will definitely tell you right now, the Gulf will definitely warm up in time for hurricane season. It is almost a guaranteed. And either way, the Gulf will always be warm enough for development no matter what, even if it's only near to slightly above normal in terms of actual sea surface temperatures in the Gulf. It is still more likely than not to generally be on average 26, 27, even 28 degrees Celsius, no matter what, by the peak season at least. So the Gulf will always be warm enough, and I want to show you here in the sea surface temperature plot. Even though the Gulf has cooled down quite a bit, notice all of these greens here throughout the Gulf, widespread. If you look on the map down here and you compare that to what these greens are that you see across the Gulf, those are still sea surface temperatures that are widespread of at least 28 degrees Celsius. And we still have portions, especially you see this part sticking out, probably associated with the Gulf Stream. That's still 29 Celsius. And even in the Bay of Campeche, 29s widespread. And then we even still have a few 30s down here in the far southern parts of the Bay of Campeche, closer to the coast. Obviously, we remember the Gulf has cooled down a lot since we used to have a lot of these very widespread 30 degrees Celsius markings in the Gulf. So obviously that part has cooled down, but the Gulf in general still on average mid to upper 80s, and that is still definitely favorable for development. And I want to again emphasize the fact that we'll probably see this all warm back up right to where it was before all this mess happened with the Central American gyre in Alberto, which obviously took away heat from the atmosphere a little bit. But it'll all warm back up in a few weeks. And trust me, the Gulf, especially as we get towards the season, will probably more than likely be piping hot. I'm just going to say that right now. Don't be shocked at what's happening right now. It'll definitely recover in the next few weeks. All right, so we have that out of the way. Let's take a look at the GFS model to see what we're expecting over at least the next week or so. Nothing really much you could see, at least on the model with 93L. There is definitely some sort of vorticity associated with it. And if you saw my Twitter post yesterday, there is actually a defined low-level center with 93L. It just seems like organization-wise, in terms of convective activity, kind of seems to be a theme, especially if you look at the last two invests we've had, including 92L and now 93L. It was the organization that really did not work in favor of 93L, but the vorticity was there, and you could see that there's definitely a defined vorticity signature that you could see in place of 93L on the GFS, although obviously by the next 24 hours, it already moves inland over Mexico, and then that is the end of that when it comes to 93L. Over the next 5 days, let's see. This is actually the part that is interesting because you see comes from some sort of energy from the MDR. I think we talked about this yesterday, but potentially one of these waves that are right now in the MDR, they move into the Caribbean. They obviously don't develop, but the GFS model, at least this run, the 6E, starts to hint potentially in the Western Caribbean around 6 to a week out. Notice, once again, vorticity bundling, energy concentrating, and that is definitely a signature on the GFS, and this is roughly the end of June. Maybe we might have another chance for potentially something to get going in the MDR. But it doesn't seem like it's the end of that, though, because judging by the GFS, there's also some other wave that tries to amplify. And I mentioned this yesterday, but it seems like multiple people on Twitter, at least, have taken note that as we get towards the end of June, it really does seem like a lot of these waves are going to try to amplify a lot more. And we might get a few chances for development. Definitely, you can see on the GFS, once again, as we get towards the 7-day mark. And this is roughly, actually, right on June 30th. So we're right at the end of June. It looks like they're hinting at potentially something else getting going in the Caribbean. Although right now, a little bit of caution because, as at least from what I checked, this is really only the GFS model that's doing this. Let's take a look at the European really quickly. Let's go to the 0Z because the 6Z doesn't go out to 1 week. But you can see European 93L, that moves into Mexico within the next day. And then as we head towards the next week, yeah, the European doesn't do much. Although it does show a little bit of energy over the Yucatan. So maybe the European too is hinting at it, but I guess the GFS model right now, we show the difference. You can see they have what almost seems to be a developing system near the Yucatan, and then moves in over the Yucatan Peninsula, and then I guess let's actually go out a little bit further. You could see GFS kind of similar to the last several systems. It kind of gets suppressed only to the southern Gulf of Mexico and Bay of Campeche, but with this one even further because there's a ridge right over the northern Gulf, so it obviously gets suppressed downward into the Bay of Campeche. But nonetheless, this is 8-9 days out. So in terms of ridging or whatever, obviously that's all bound to change. But nonetheless, I think the biggest thing to take away is that there is energy on the GFS that does try to concentrate. And it is not the only model per se that is doing this when you count the ensembles. And I'm going to show you really quickly with the European ensembles. They actually have, and there it is actually. This is the European ensemble run from the 0Z today. Over the next 10 days, this is how far it goes out. You notice they also do indeed show some sort of energy that tries to get going in the Caribbean. And then this is right towards the end of June into the first day or two of July, notice that the European ensembles too, like I mentioned, that people are taking interest on Twitter. Some of them are spinning a few of these lows up into potentially trackable, or at least what we look at the European ensembles, you notice they do show some lows beginning to pop up in the MDR. So generally what I think the biggest takeaway is that the signals are there. Things are still yet to be determined on what exactly is going to happen, because once again, this is all 7 to 10 days out. But the biggest point I'm trying to bring to you guys is that it definitely looks like we could be looking at more activity as we head into the end of the month and into the start of next month, which is July. And maybe we might get Beryl very soon. Maybe we might not have to wait as long as we did to get Alberto as we might for Beryl, and maybe Chris if we get more developments with this system. It's all up in the air though, but don't let your guard down. Obviously, we're in hurricane season, and honestly, at any time, if something is able to develop, it'll probably try to, especially in a year like this where it is expected to be active. So things may be looking like quiet for now. Maybe in the next week or so, things might be not as active, but as we head into the last part of June, into early July, that's when I think maybe once again we might need to watch for development. Okay? All right. With that being said, I'm going to end it off for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, always encourage you to like, comment, subscribe. Comment your thoughts as well. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, I will definitely try to respond below. So shoot them in the comments. With that being said, stay safe. Have a blessed day. A safe one as well. Peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we will talk again tomorrow.